All right.
Alright, I'm Jessica at the medical examiner's office. This is Jamie. She is newer to doing this type of presentation, so she's kind of here with me just to see how it goes, and she'll be here in the future. So we both work in the medical examiner's office where we do death investigations. So some of the slides in here can be a little graphic, so we'll give you a warning before that comes up. So one of the main questions we get all the time is, what's the difference between a medical examiner and a coroner? Well, virtually there's not much difference. We do the same exact job. The only difference is how we get that job. A medical examiner is appointed, and you'll get hired based upon your criteria that the county sets forth. And then, whereas a coroner is elected. So to be elected, you have to be over the age of 18, a resident of the county, and get one more vote from your opponent. There's not typically an education requirement or a training requirement with that job. And you serve a 4-year term. After your 4 years is up, you have to run again. So you're never really guaranteed to be reelected for your position. So Marathon County, we are a medical examiner's office system where I'm appointed. I get to keep my job as long as our administrator is happy with the work I'm doing.
So what year is this for you now?
11. Time goes by way too fast. All right, so medical examiner and coroner positions are state mandated positions that every county throughout the United States has to have someone designated to conduct death investigations. Each county and state is set up differently for how that is run. For example, in Florida, they have districts where they have multiple counties for a region that do their death investigation. Whereas in Wisconsin, we just have each county does it unless if you have an intergovernmental agreement for another county. So all of our job is to determine the cause and manner of death for individuals. There's a million different causes of death, and that is individualized to that particular person as to how they died. For example, if someone had a heart attack, they had a heart attack, but they had really bad coronary artery disease, hypertension, and also high cholesterol levels, which that would all be listed on the death certificate, which might be different from someone else who had a heart attack, who had different medical histories. Or another example is someone who died of a heroin overdose with any of their significant mental health conditions as contributing factors. So for manners of death, there are only 5 manners of death. Those 5 manners are natural, accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. Sometimes your manner of death is very clear. You have someone who's deceased with a gunshot wound. Now you're trying to figure out how that gunshot wound got to that individual. Were they accidentally loading a gun and it misfired, where it would be an accidental? Were they upset with their life and completed suicide? Or did someone shoot them and it would be homicide? Or do we really not know based upon the scene investigation interviews and then it's an undetermined death?
You can finish before you can answer.
We typically try to avoid undetermined as much as possible and to get a definitive manner. However, every year we have roughly 1 to 2 undetermined deaths.
What are your names? I'm sorry.
Oh, Jessica,
Jessica?
and then that's Jamie.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So training to become a medical examiner, there is no standardized training program. That a lot of the training is on-the-job training that you receive. And like I said, each county is set up different with different requirements as to what they would want. But typically, it's medical background for nurses or someone with an emergency medical background, such as an EMT or a paramedic. Otherwise, retired law enforcement officers is kind of the general rule. Sometimes physicians in larger counties, if your population is over 500,000 in Wisconsin, you have to have a forensic pathologist, which is a doctor, be a medical examiner.
So were you a registered nurse, or what path were you?
I'm a registered nurse. I have my master's degree in forensic nursing with an emphasis in death investigation.
And I have my bachelor's in nursing, and I have worked in the emergency department for several years.
So the one training that we all have as coroners and medical examiners throughout the U.S. is the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigation certification. So it's a pretty in-depth certification where you have to pass all of these skills and be checked off, and also pass a board registered examination and complete continuing education hours to maintain that. So all of our full-time staff members in the office are ABMDI certified, and we're working on getting all of our on-call staff members ABMDI certified.
So how often do you have to do your research or updates?
Every 5 years.
And how many hours?
It is, I think 80 total. I'm pretty sure it's 80 in that 5 years. So in Marathon County, for my position, you have to have either a bachelor's or a master's degree. Like I said, I do have a master's degree in forensic nursing. For the chief deputy and our full-time deputy medical examiners is either an associate degree or a bachelor's degree. And we prefer our people to have degrees in education and either be a registered nurse or a paramedic. We found that having the good medical background is essential on scenes just because we're able to look at medications and understanding what medical conditions that person had, and also look at the body to find stuff, which we'll get into a little bit later. In our office, we have 1 full-time medical examiner, 1 full-time chief deputy medical examiners, 2 full-time deputy medical examiners, and 5 on-call deputy medical examiners. So we're a fairly large office. So, for us to take jurisdiction of a case, there's a few different things that have to happen for us to be involved with the death investigation. So the main thing is physicians cannot sign any death certificate if it is not 100% natural. So even someone who's 95 years old and fractures their hip and then dies as a result of complications from that hip fracture, that would become a medical examiner's office case because that would be an accidental death, and we have to look into how that fall occurred. Usually these are nothing suspicious, but sometimes you might have something suspicious if someone got pushed down the stairs or anything else. So it's kind of a check and balance that the state has set up. And then also, if there's any type of old injury, so someone could get in a car crash when they're a teenager and become paralyzed and die 20 years later from pneumonia, from being bedridden. Well, that is actually would be the car crash that caused them to be paralyzed would have to be on that death certificate because that was a significant injury that changed the course of their life. So then we would have to get involved with that too. So pretty much we investigate anything that's not natural, and then any time that someone dies outside the care of a physician. So if someone's at home and dies in hospice or at a nursing home, as long as the death does not have any injuries involved in it, then the doctor can sign those cases. If there are any injuries, we have to sign those. If someone dies suddenly at home, even if they're elderly or young, our office would have to investigate that just because that person was not under the care of a physician. All right, so conducting death investigations. So typically when we're notified of death, dispatch lets us know that we have a death. Typically we're provided very minimal information. We have a deceased 40-year-old male at this address, law enforcement is on scene. Once in a great while we might have a little bit more information, so most of the time we go in kind of blind, not really realizing what we're walking into. When we get to scene, we're typically briefed by law enforcement and detectives. They give us any demographic information about the decedent, a brief history provided about what happened and the circumstances surrounding the death, initial scene observations, the location and condition of the body, which is important for us to know what type of potentially hazards that we're going into, and then any concerns they have with the scene, the history, or interview statements. So then when we go through, we do a scene investigation, we do a complete scene walkthrough. We photograph the scene, we look for anything out of place or concerning that could also things that could help us determine what happened to this individual. And we ensure the scene matches the history that's provided. We also interview witnesses. We typically like to know the last 24 to 48 hours of the decedent's life, what was happening, and then past medical, social, and mental health history, and also the circumstances of the death. So scene observations are very important. And these are just some basic pictures. If we walked into a scene like that one, we would be concerned just because it looks like it was ransacked, but it looks more like it was stage one, where we might get more concerned with what you're seeing with the decedent. This is a nice clean hoarding house, and I say clean because a lot of hoarding houses are not new items stacked up nicely. Sometimes you walk into houses and there's garbage this deep, there's insect infestations, there's not very pleasant situation. But that's important to know because that might show you how that decedent, that person has lived and might help you determine what happened. Such as this scene, there's some blood on the ground where you would want to know what happened to the decedent. Is there any injuries to that person? What do those injuries look like? If you open up a drawer and see this, you get very concerned for an overdose. Our scenes could be anywhere from a house to any public building you can imagine, to on the side of the road, to woods. I mean, anywhere you could possibly go is where we could have a death investigation. So then we document the scene, we do a body examination, and I'll be going into a lot of these in more detail, but we have to do positive identification to the decedent, which we work with law enforcement. Our job is to determine the time of death based upon their postmortem changes, the location of death if the body was moved postmortem. We look for any medical findings and then also any injuries. We also do photograph the scene and the decedent, where we do overall photos of the decedent. Then we do closer up photos of the decedent, and then we photograph any type of injuries or identifying features. So now here comes the more graphic photos, just to warn you. So positive identification, so it's our responsibility to do positive identification. Law enforcement also assists with that. Sometimes it's very easy. You could look at a photograph of a driver's license and say, yep, that's Mr. Smith, and you're done. Sometimes it's a lot more difficult, such as if you have someone with significant postmortem changes or someone who has a lot of injury to the body, such as a fire victim, where you need to do either dental fingerprints, DNA, or sometimes other means, such as if they had a pacemaker. A lot of times there's different serial numbers on those devices where you can tie it back. So postmortem changes help us to determine the time of death. So there's 4 things we really look for with postmortem changes: rigor mortis, livor mortis, algor mortis, and decomposition. There's different sides in all of them except for the algor mortis, which is the cooling of the body. The algor mortis is probably the most unstable of all postmortem changes, just because there's a lot of things that can affect those, such as if someone is fully clothed in a snowsuit in the middle of summer, they're going to be warmer longer compared to someone who is naked on a concrete floor. Their body temperature are going to cool a lot faster. So that's kind of one that you have to take the environmental conditions and also what the person is wearing and if they're covered or uncovered into consideration when determining that. So livor mortis is a settling of blood in the lower dependent portion of the body, causing a reddish, purple, pink discoloration to the skin. So after someone dies, the blood starts to pool based upon gravity, whatever position you're in. Wherever is the lowest, more dependent position is going to be where the blood pools. So what's helpful for us is it can help us determine if that body was moved after the person had died, and also helps us determine how long that individual has been dead. Within, from death to about 12 hours, the livor is able to be blanched. Blanching meaning if you put pressure on it and let go, there's a white area. After 12 hours, when you do that to livor, it typically stays fixed, so you can't move it or blanch it. So with that, if say you had this individual and they're laying face down, I could easily tell you that that person has been moved prior to death, because this part was on the ground when that person died and the blood pooled to their back area. So then that should be, it would be consistent with that person laying on their back. So if they're not in that position, then we would get more concerned. So rigor mortis is the chemical changes in the body that cause the body to start stiffening. And just like the livor mortis, it is very helpful for us to determine the time of death with that, based upon that change along with the livor mortis. The nice thing else with rigor mortis is whatever position you die in is the position that starts to change in. So if I'm sitting in a chair, my rigor mortis is going to be starting to fix into that position that I'm in. So typically within the first 24 hours, it starts to set, and after 24 hours, it starts to dissipate, and it's completely dissipated after 48 hours. So that window helps us determine the time frame of death. The next one is more graphic, just to warn you. If anyone doesn't want to see any graphic, please look down because we're talking about decomposition. So decomposition is the next thing that happens. Usually around the 72-hour mark, we'll start to see a little bit of bleeding in the abdomen. That is because that is where most of the bacteria within your whole system are within your intestines, and that starts to decompose first, so that's the first area we see that. And then after that is when it starts to progress. It's never really a pretty situation, however, it is helpful for us to determine a time frame of death. The biggest thing with the decomposition is after a certain point, it gets very difficult to determine the time frame because people change at different rates, and it does impact if someone has any type of medical condition such as untreated diabetes, where their blood sugar would be higher, and a few other factors such as environmental. So these are some additional findings that we look for, and this is why it's very important for us as an office to have people with a medical background, just because we can look at some of these changes and figure out what happened. So such as this picture, that's what's called petechial hemorrhaging. If we ever see those, we would get concerned for potentially strangulation. It can happen with aggressive CPR and a few other measures, but that is an indicative sign of strangulation, which we would definitely look into a little further. This is just senile ecchymosis, just elderly bruising. Doesn't necessarily mean it's from trauma or anything else. Whereas this is more traumatic bruising. That is what is called dicing injuries. We see that in car crashes when the side windows break. It's little cubes of glass, and it causes that pattern, which is important because we can help determine where in that car that person was seated. That is just the picture of peripheral vascular disease, where if we see that, we would know that that individual has a lot of circulation problems, potentially congestive heart failure. Just a laceration and injury. If you see this, it's called a bone cone. So that is indicative